Well, hello, everyone. This is an amazing number of people in this room, given what's happening in Wellesley tonight. So we are so glad to see you all here. I am Judy Barr. I'm Vice President of the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust. We've been in existence since 1958, one of the earliest land trusts in the state. And tonight we co-sponsoring this event with the library, but also for the first time we've done a co-sponsorship with the Wellesley Neighbors, which was established in 2011, which is for seniors in the city that we do. I'm in both groups, so I can talk about we's in both ways, but I have to clarify. The Wellesley Neighbors do a number of things such as lectures, co-sponsoring this, such as interest groups, a culinary interest group, a dining out interest group, a history of Wellesley interest group. There's a number of things here in Wellesley that they do. And what's exciting about this being a talk from the Land Trust about Guernsey, the overlap between those is really present here in an individual tonight, because Janet Geely, who is the original founder of Wellesley Neighbors, as well as its first president, was a professor at Wellesley College when Janet Guernsey was a professor at Wellesley College, and knew Janet Guernsey well. And she's been making contacts with other former Wellesley College professors, and we're going to get them together as a group. And because of this and the work of Alisa Fine, who's put this evening together, we're going to make this thing happen. So I want to introduce you to Janet Geely. Now, the other thing about Guernsey Sanctuary, it's half in Wellesley and half in Needham. So question, how many of you are from Needham? Yay. And one of yours, welcome to the other side of the world. And so the rest of you, how many of you are from Wellesley? Okay. How many have your primary route in the Conservation Land Trust? Oh, come on, I know some of you are here. Are members of well, how many are members of the Conservation Land Trust, Wellesley Conservation? Okay. How many are members of Wellesley Neighbor? See? We made some connections tonight. And all because of Alisa Fine, who was able to receive a grant from the Fund for Wellesley, which allowed her to start putting together a program on Storyscapes, telling stories about land in different ways, an economic way, a geologic way, a historical way, ecological way. And those three tracks are represented tonight, and Alisa put it all together, and we'll be doing more on it, more in-depth looks at the Guernsey Sanctuary from different stories it can tell. So with that, thank you very much for coming, and Alisa's going to take over and run the meeting from now on. Lisa.
Well, Judy, you're giving me too much credit. This is a team effort, and I wanted to start. Well, first of all, I wanted to start by welcoming everyone. Judy and I counted at least 3 competing events that were happening in Wellesley tonight, not to mention the jury weather and the rain. So we decided this morning that the folks who came out tonight were going to be the super passionate, most excited audience ever to come out to choose this over all of the other things going on, to hear more about Storyscapes. So I really, really appreciate everyone being here. And again, you're giving me too much credit. This is a team effort. Our panelists, I'm so grateful for all of the time that you have devoted to helping me put this together. I'm going to talk a little more in a minute about the genesis for Storyscapes and the idea, but I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the Land Trust, and Judy, you provided a lot of logistical and moral support to me in the last couple of months and weeks, so thank you. And thank you to our co-sponsors as well, and the Wellesley Library. Okay, so this word Storyscapes is going to come up a lot in the course of the next hour or so. So I just wanted to start off by explaining what that word means to me and how this event came about. So I have a master's degree in geography. I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder. And in grad school at Boulder, I became really fascinated with this idea that the physical landscapes that we see around us, whether an urban streetscape or a garden, a park, or a trail, all of these landscapes tell stories. And if we know how to look for and read these stories, we're able to more deeply understand what surrounds us. Some of these landscapes that we see might seem mundane and ordinary, but using all of these different perspectives in combination really helps us uncover all these deep layers that a physical landscape can tell us about. So really the genesis for this event started about 2.5 years ago when I just had this seed of an idea. I thought, Storyscapes, that encapsulates how I like to think about the physical landscape. You know, looking at it from all these different perspectives and disciplines, and you know, how can I get people as excited about Storyscapes as I am? I joined the Land Trust, and then I became aware of the Community Fund for Wellesley opportunity. So I applied for a grant from the Community Fund on behalf of the Land Trust. I received the grant, and with that grant funding over the last year, I have worked to produce this panel and put together research focused on Guernsey. And the reason we decided to focus on Guernsey as kind of a pilot case for Storyscapes is because it's low-hanging fruit. It's very interesting, and there's so many fascinating stories that come together in the sanctuary that are already pretty well researched. And so what we're going to do here is kind of put those stories all out on the table, and our panelists are going to be kind of coming at this landscape from different perspectives, and then at the end, we'll hopefully have some time. We will have some time. I will make sure of it, because I'll keep everyone on time. We'll have some time for some cross-disciplinary conversation and discussion and Q&A. Okay. So, thanks, Judy. I think that I came up with this word Storyscapes. I'm not sure if I did, but I think I did. But I did not invent the underlying concept of Storyscapes. And that underlying concept has been floating around in different circles and academics for a long time. So I want to give credit to the folks who came up with the underlying concept, which is landscape literacy. It's the idea that you can pick apart a physical landscape as you would a book, that there's vocabulary associated with a physical landscape, just as there is with, you're learning to read. And by understanding the vocabulary, you can read the landscape. So Anne Whitson-Spurn is a professor of planning and architecture at MIT. I have her book over there on the table, The Language of Landscape, and she was really the one who invented this term, landscape literacy. And I really love this quote that is in this book, The Language of Landscape, over there on the table. And I thought it was very inspiring, so I just wanted to flash it up here on the screen. And by the way, early on in the process of thinking about this panel, I emailed Anne, and I asked her what she thought, and she said, "You're on the right track." So she couldn't come tonight, but she thinks I'm on the right track, so that's good. Okay. So now we have some understanding of what I mean by storyscapes and landscape literacy. And I promise in a second I'm going to bring us to Guernsey. But first, I just wanted to have a very, very quick interactive storyscapes exercise just to help kind of prime our thinking before we hear from our panelists. This is Longfellow Pond in Wellesley, and I just want everyone to look at this photo for a moment, and if you can just start shouting out words, shout out something that you think about when you see this photo. Don't be shy. Water. Trees. Reflection. Pond lilies. Eskers. Ooh, good, Chris. You're not a plant. Because that's the next thing I'm going to talk about. Okay. Anything else? Shades of green. Shades of green. Yep, I like it. So just even in 15 seconds, all these different words, we can see that this landscape means a lot of different things to different people. This landscape tells us different stories. And by using Storyscapes as a tool or a framework, we can start to see all of the layers that are embedded in the pond. So I'm just going to race through a moment to give you some highlights of some of these stories that are embedded in Longfellow Pond as a quick example before we get to Guernsey. So one story is that the pond and the surrounding area tells us about the glaciation of New England. 15,000 to 20,000 years ago in this area, there was an enormous glacier, they think a mile thick in some places, and it covered all of New England. The glacier left very distinctive features on the landscape, including all over New England, but including at Longfellow, and I'll try and use this pointer over here. You can kind of see what is an esker, which is a very typical glacial feature. And Chris, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's a river that forms underneath a glacier, right? It gets filled up with silt and gravel, and then the glacier melts and it becomes a hill. Is that
exactly it?
Okay?
It ends up being the reverse imprint of the river that
Reverse
pulls
imprint.
the water away from the glacier.
Yeah, and you can kind of see it over here. So Longfellow Pond is a story of glaciation. Another story of the pond was its importance to Wellesley and Newton industrial development. The pond itself was created by a Wellesley resident named Charles Petty in 1815. He dammed what was then called the Rosemary Brook, and most likely he created that dam to power a mill that he used in nail manufacturing. That same mill was later used in paper manufacturing, and then it burned down in the late 1860s. The pond was later used as a source of ice blocks, so used in Wellesley ice harvesting businesses. That ice was packed into sawdust. It was transported all over Wellesley and nearby suburbs in horse-drawn carts or later on trucks for icebox refrigeration. And that period of the Longfellow ice harvesting was between the late 1860s and mid-1920s. The pond and surrounding area also tells a story about our Wellesley resident predecessors. After the rise of electric refrigeration, the ice making stopped, and then part of the area surrounding the pond was used as a burial plot for the Hastings family that lived nearby and their home. And this picture shows the vestiges of what was called Rosemary Street that connected Route 9 and Oakland streets, and it was most likely used as a cart path by the Hastings family to access their property. And of course, today, the pond tells the story of, it's a recreational area, it's a conservation area, it's managed and maintained by the town. So again, I just used Longfellow Pond as a very brief example to show you how by taking Storyscapes as a tool or a framework, we can uncover all these interesting stories that become physically embedded into this landscape. So with that, we come to Guernsey, and hopefully many of you are already familiar with Guernsey or have walked through it. If you haven't, or even if you have, we encourage you to join us in early November for a guided Storyscapes walk with two of our panelists. And Judy, we're going to offer that in early November. I think November 2nd was the date, so watch out for more notification. Guernsey is the largest of the land trust's 10 properties, 25 acres. It was also the first sanctuary acquired by the land trust in 1958. It has a trail loop, access to Sabrina Lake and Oak Island, which pokes out into the water and has really beautiful views. And of course, it's the subject of our panel presentations today. I just want to say one more thing about the Guernsey family before I introduce our panelists. So Guernsey was donated to the Land Trust in 1958 by William and Janet Guernsey. They had 5 children. Janet attended Wellesley College, was a colleague of Janet Geely. Thank you for being here, Janet. And she received a PhD in physics from MIT. As part of the research I did for Storyscapes, I reached out to the youngest Guernsey child, Madeline Rudd, who was also the only daughter. And Madeline wrote me a really nice email about her childhood growing up alongside what would become the sanctuary. And I thought this told a really nice story of how this land could be a place to play and explore. So I just want to read a few sentences from her email. She wrote, "We, of course, spent time on Sabrina Lake canoeing and swimming. We sometimes parked the canoe to walk along the levee. The levee was the easiest part of walking around the lake. Other parts required walking across people's property, or in some places there was too much undergrowth to do that. My fondest memory was our 2 dogs, Piggy and Piglet. They would chase each other, and they would continue by swimming across the lake, and you could hear them barking as they chased each other through the swamp." So I appreciate that memory from Madeline. And with that all as context, I'm just going to quickly introduce our panelists, and we'll get on with the presentation. Chris Crowley is going to present first. Chris is treasurer of the Land Trust Board of Directors, and he's a geology expert who has presented many geology walks and talks on behalf of the Land Trust. And Chris is going to talk about the underlying geology of Guernsey and the surrounding area. Lisa Moore is Education and Outreach Coordinator with the Wellesley Natural Resources Commission. She's a naturalist by training, and she's done a lot of work in environmental education. Lisa is going to present on the natural environment and biology and ecology of the sanctuary. And finally, we have Gloria Greis, Executive Director of the Needham History Center. Gloria has done a lot of research on William Emerson Baker, who was the owner of the Ridge Hill Estate that was located near Guernsey Sanctuary some 80 or more years before it became the Guernsey home and then a land trust property. And so Gloria will present the historic perspective of this property and specifically focused on the Baker Estate. I'm going to ask everyone to hold questions until the end, and then we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. So with that, that was too long, but Chris, I hand it to you. Do you need this, please? Yep.
So thank you, Alisa, and thank you for all the work to put this together and give us this framework to speak in. I love that concept of developing a vocabulary to read the landscape. And when I do the geological walks in different parts of Wellesley, that's always my goal is to let people know that on every block, probably literally every yard in Wellesley, every property, there are signs of that geological history. You can see signs of volcanoes, signs of earthquakes, signs of enormous glaciers. So I'm going to touch on now some of the signs that you can see at Guernsey. There's many more than I chose to talk on here, but we will. We'll start with that. So first off, Guernsey and Wellesley and Needham started out 750 million years ago as part of a volcanic island chain. And that chain traveled across an ocean which has disappeared at this time and eventually smashed into North America, what would become North America, to become the East Coast. On its way across that ocean, it collided with another continent before it hit North America, and there's signs of that collision that you can see still at Guernsey. About 2 million years ago, Alisa mentioned the glaciation. We entered an ice age, and for 2 million years, there was a glacier. It was 2 miles high in places. It was probably only a mile high over Guernsey. But glaciers flow. So they're constantly moving forward. The snow falls in the middle and it flows over the land, probably slower than we would notice, but it's constantly grinding. So for 2 million years, the glacier ground over Guernsey. And you might think that would mean that it would grind that land flat, but it didn't. You think of the cliff that you see in front of the Wellesley train station, and all of the bedrock then that goes up to form the Cliff Estates area. And there's different properties in Wellesley where someone has 20 feet, they have a piece of bedrock that's 20 feet high in their yard. Their neighbor goes to build a home. The builder drills down 30 feet. There's 2 properties with the most terrific exposures in Wellesley where I've talked with the builders. 30 feet down, they're still just digging through sand or clay. So the underlying bedrock is going all up and down. So the first question, right as we get to Guernsey, this is looking at the entrance from Winding River Road, is why is that so flat? Like if the bedrock, the glacier scraped it absolutely clean and then left that mountainous landscape, why do we see this? And the reason is that for decades, perhaps a century or more, the glacier melted, but it didn't melt all at once. It's not like, oh, this summer was real hot, and so the glacier all melted away. It took years and years for it to ebb past this region. And while the Charles River Valley was still filled with ice, the water that was melting off had nowhere to go, and it formed what's called a proglacial lake. And almost everywhere in Wellesley where you see the roads like this and neighborhoods like this, if you look at Weston Road, if you look at Route 16, if you look at Winding River in front of Guernsey, the reason that we have that flat, super buildable land is because of the time that lake spent here. The water is pouring off the glacier. There's silt and dust and gravel and stuff coming off of it. It's not a clear blue lake that you're looking at. It's muddy, it's watering, so it's got silt and stuff falling out of it all over and forms a very flat, even surface. And it's not a round lake, so it's not that it covered the whole region. There was bedrock sticking up all over the place or other gravel that the glacier had left. So you'll find these fingers of where the lake went, and it goes all through Needham and Wellesley and Dover and Newton and surrounding towns, while the Charles River Valley was stopped up, that water stood. So that's the first thing that you can see just as you're at the very entrance to Wellesley, to Guernsey. The next thing you notice, and you'll see these all over town, all over the region as well, is that there are rocks. Sometimes people have moved them and put them into a wall or put them into a foundation. Lots of times they're just sitting there on the ground in front of you. And this was actually the first clue to uncoding that there had been an ice age. This was the first thing that the original geologists were trying to explain, were why are these boulders in the middle of nowhere that look just like the boulders that are at the end of a melting glacier? And they said, maybe it's the same reason. And in fact, it is. And you'll find these boulders all over the Guernsey property. Some of them have been moved now into walls. Many of those might have come 1,000 miles. So the glacier is flowing that whole time, it's moving the whole time, carries some of them thousands of miles. This one, it probably only carried a few hundred feet or maybe 1,000 feet. And I can tell that because it's Roxbury pudding stone is what that rock is made of. And that's a local bedrock that's only here in the Boston Basin. And that rock, the fault that is the beginning of the Roxbury pudding stone is basically just on the other side of the Charles River there. So the rock, which was carried south by the glacier, couldn't have started more than basically by the Charles River. So this one probably dropped just from the house across the street. But there are rocks that you can find on the property that are much more rounded, even though it's granite. You know, it's a super hard rock. It takes a lot of rolling from ice to turn granite into a round ball. So you know that when you see that, you know that the rock had to have come from much further away. And better geologists than me can look at it and often identify, well, that granite really looks like the granite from Mount Wachusett or from this place in the White Mountains, because granite is very different depending on the conditions that it formed in. And this pudding stone, we know how old it is because it has some of the rocks that are embedded in it are made of this same Dedham granite that is the cliff material that we see at the Wellesley train station and a bunch of other places in town. And we know exactly how old that is. This was formed right after that began eroding as the edge of that volcanic island chain. And a little bit further as we walk, we'll see what I believe is actual bedrock that is that Roxbury pudding stone. And this is the evidence of that continental collision, because this was after the island chain was already 150 million years old or so. It had another giant period of volcanism because of that collision. And then in the tectonic uplift that followed, this granite got exposed and then began to erode. And this is from the continental shelf of that island chain. We don't, unfortunately, have any fossils in that, because this happened just before the explosion of life on Earth. So which was about 550 million years ago, and this is like 590 million years old. There's just in some of the youngest Roxbury pudding stone, there are some tiny fossils that people have uncovered or believe that they've uncovered, but not in the rocks that we have here in Wellesley. So you begin to see that bedrock as you walk along. I'm thinking it's bedrock because I know that bedrock is exposed in some of the neighboring properties. I could be fooled that it's a big boulder that then got covered by dirt, but there is bedrock in neighboring properties if this particular piece sticking out is not. As you walk a little further, you see a kettle hole, and there's a few places in Guernsey that have small depressions, these circular depressions in the ground. Often they'll fill with water, at least for part of the year. That's a lot of the vernal pools in the area are kettle holes. And there's a much larger one. If you do make it on our walk in November, we'll walk by a much larger kettle pond that is on the Guernsey property. And it's fascinating to me how these things form. And they form when a piece of the glacier breaks off while it's melting, and for some reason it lasts a little longer than the others. It gets covered with dirt and gravel, and then it's insulated, so the glacier all melts around it, and all of that dirt and gravel and silt and whatever is pouring off, so it gets buried further and further. And it can be decades, it can be hundreds of years that it stays an ice ball under the ground until finally the climate changes so much that it reaches even down 20, 30 feet, however far down that ball of ice was when it got buried there. When it finally melts, that land collapses. It's like a sinkhole. So it's not that you're looking at the impression that a giant heavy ball of ice made in the land. It's that somewhere far underground, the thing finally melted and everything dropped when that happened. And they can be very different sizes. Some people say that the basin that Morris's Pond is in is a kettle hole. There's even a claim that Lake Waban is a kettle hole. I'm not certain that that one is true, but they do come, up to that big. You'll see them, everywhere from 15 feet across to, to miles across. Finally, you mentioned the eskers, which I didn't know you were going to mention that in the preview. Longfellow Pond was dammed up, and it formed a pond. Morris's Pond is another man-made pond in town, and those dams could be put in place there because of the glacial formations that were around them. So Longfellow Pond actually has eskers on both sides. That's what formed the walls around Rosemary Brook that allowed them to put a dam in one little place and get a pond out of it. When we look at Sabrina Lake, you look at that straight edge, and this is another man-made lake, or Lake Sabrina, but you can tell that this was made by engineers because the eskers, if you walk them, and many of the walking trails in Wellesley are atop eskers. If you're walking and you're looking down on both sides, it's a trail that's the top of an esker. But this one is much too straight. Those are sinuous paths, and they're full of cobbles and rocks that you have to step over. While this is, dirt and sand, and it's ruler straight. So as you look at that, you can tell, well, this isn't a feature of the glaciation. This is a feature that somebody must have put here. And in fact, we'll learn a little while later about who did that and why. So that's as I look at Wellesley, that's the Guernsey, that's the geological story that speaks out to me. And hopefully you have some of that vocabulary to take away. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa. Thank you.
Just moving this forward, is that? Thanks. Hello. Happy to be here tonight to speak a little bit about the ecology of Guernsey. I've had the fortune to take some Wellesley students out through Guernsey for eco camp for the past few summers as part of my work for the Natural Resources Commission. So I've got to learn about Guernsey through my preparation for taking the kids there for eco camp, and it's a lovely sanctuary, and it does tell some interesting stories. And I never heard of the word Storyscape before I was asked to be a part of this, but part of my teaching, I'm always telling the kids that if you look around you, there's clues around you, and they're telling you what's going on around you. And if I would take them on a geology walk, I was like, every rock tells a story. And, as Chris said, when they're rounded, I ask the kids, why is this round? Oh, it did something, right? So looking at the ecology of Guernsey, we look at a few things to get the bigger picture. So when we look at the area where Guernsey is in the middle, and you can see how it's surrounded by lots of wet areas. The green is kind of wetland areas, right? The blue is more water. There are contiguous forest lands around Guernsey. There are areas where there are definitely channels where wildlife can travel from one part of a sanctuary. I think the Hale Sanctuary is over there, and the what's the name of the sanctuary? I can't read. The Susan Lee Sanctuary. So there are sort of these passageways that wildlife can take from one area that's protected to another area. So that's why we are allowed to get some of this larger wildlife that can be supported in our town, because there are areas where they can find place to live. So ecology is the study of the interaction between the living and non-living things in an area. I always tell the students when I take them out around town to go on nature walks, I'm like, are we ever going to see a polar bear in Wellesley? You know, and they're like, no, Mrs. Moore, you're so silly. And I said, why aren't we going to see a polar bear? Well, it's not cold enough for a polar bear, right? And yeah, and what else don't we have? Well, we don't have, an ocean in Wellesley. Excellent, right? So when we talk about the ecology, those non-living parts of the area where we are have an impact on what can grow and live and be around our town. Oh, it's not cool. I'm not the technological wizard. There you go. And let me just do the arrows?
Yeah.
That's fine. All right, so lay of the land, we were looking at,
If you need a pointer.
oh, okay. We were looking at Sabrina Lake. We saw the Charles River is down on the left edge of that screen. And vernal pools, which were mentioned a little bit in the previous discussion, those are in red and blue. Certified vernal pools are in red, non-certified are in blue. And there is a certified vernal pool in in Guernsey Sanctuary. There are lots of intermittent streams that run through the area, open space of Guernsey that surrounds all that, so that's why we can get a lot of various things living there. All right. Different habitats in Guernsey support different types of biodiversity. So there's parts of Guernsey Sanctuary where you'll see a lot of hardwood trees, and then there are parts of Guernsey Sanctuary where you'll see some softwood trees. Then there are wet areas that are, kind of boggy and wet all the time, and then there are some areas that are seasonally wet. You'll pass over certain little bridges when you go to Guernsey, and sometimes there's a stream running through it, and sometimes there's not, right? Depends on the season. And all of that impacts the life and when we say life, both the plant and animal life that can come and be a part of this incredible habitat. So one of the vernal pools are like one of my favorite things to study as an environmental educator, and there is a vernal pool in Guernsey, and it's a really unique and special habitat. And when we talk about the link between, the land and the living things that are in it, right? That's where we're looking about the ecology. When there is a very specific connection to one type of environment and a living thing, we call it an ecological niche. And vernal pools have that connection, that in order to be classified as a vernal pool, there has to be at least one of 3 different obligate species living in that environment to be called a vernal pool. And when we look at biodiversity in Guernsey or in a vernal pool, you're going to be looking for things that identify that as a vernal pool and not just a big puddle in the woods, right? So what makes it a vernal pool is the presence of either fairy shrimp, which are these little things right down here. Now, you can see here's a little egg sac in the fairy shrimp. You can see, this was in a soup spoon. I took a picture of it in a plain white soup spoon, right? So these are tiny little organisms, but their presence in the vernal pool automatically classifies that as a vernal pool, because these animals only spend their life cycle in a vernal pool. And what's unique about vernal pools and why these animals can survive in there is because they dry up at certain times during the year, right? And when they dry up, these animals that require water either have to go through a metamorphosis and leave the vernal pool, right, and continue their life, or hunker down in the mud and muck in the vernal pool underneath the water there and wait it out until, it fills up with runoff again. Because in order to be called a vernal pool, it also can't have an inlet or outlet of a stream. So if there's no inlet or outlet, there's no fish in a vernal pool. And that's why the 2 other obligate species, to be a vernal pool, use them for their mating and for them to raise their young, and that would be the wood frog or the spotted salamander. So when you go to Guernsey, if you were able to see these fairy shrimp, then you know automatically certified. If it has the presence of the other two obligate species and some other conditions, then it also can be certified as a vernal pool. Vernal pools are like my favorite thing to study. I was doing something for the town for City Nature Challenge. I don't know if any of you know about that, but it's something where we go around the town and we assess the biodiversity around town. And I found a new vernal pool by finding fairy shrimp in the water. And I was in the middle of the woods by myself, and it's not a certified vernal pool in town yet. And here I am with this, walking in the mud and muck, and I find that I'm like, oh my God! So I don't know if anybody in the middle of the woods heard me screaming with happiness that I found these, and hopefully it will be certified in the next, several months. But it's exciting stuff when you find it. Biodiversity tells us that we're living in a healthy environment. So the greater the biodiversity, the healthier it is for every living thing. And people forget that we are part of the food web and the food chain. So these small things, them existing, is what allows us to keep existing, right? So protecting this habitat is so important, because without it, then those creatures have no place to exist. Okay, there's lots of biodiversity in the plants and the funguses and things in Guernsey. One of the interesting things about Guernsey is it's been significantly impacted by humans, right? It was changed when the Baker Estate was created. So there are going to be plants that you're going to find in Guernsey that are native. There are going to be some plants you're going to find in Guernsey that have, a completely different part of the world where they come from. And one of them, if you see the purple arrow there, that's an Amur cork tree. All right, and you can find these cork trees scattered around town. It's not native, and yet I find them over by Sprague School. I have found them over by Morse's Pond. So these were planted in various areas like the Baker Estate and some other manufactured kind of arboretums and things early on in town history, and through seed dispersal, now you find them all over town, right? And then you'll also find some things like, if you look at this tree right here, and you see how it's all kind of corkscrew, that tree was growing with an invasive species wrapped around it, right? Oriental bittersweet, and that vine that wrapped around it strangled this tree basically as it grew. And then at some point later on in the tree's life, we removed that vine of the Oriental bittersweet, probably when Guernsey was being, cleaned up and managed, and you can still see the scars from that, invasive species. So interesting, because it is somewhat disturbed habitat, and then over the years, then you become to how, basically ecology wants to keep changing. So what you're going to see is that there's this kind of evolution of the land as time goes by, until you get to this kind of complex ending of the mature species. Navigating Guernsey Sanctuary. Hopefully you'll join us later in the fall and take a walk with us. It's an interesting trail. There is definitely an area there's lots of routes to navigate, but there's also some boardwalk. But what's wonderful about Guernsey is in a very short walk, you can see like at least 3 different types of habitat as you're walking through. And therefore you're going to see different types of flora and fauna as you go through the different habitat. Okay, that's my part.
Hey. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Thank you for Lisa for setting this up, and my partners in crime, Chris and Lisa, for setting me up so nicely. Let me use the arrows. Yeah, okay. Just because I'm going to use maps a lot, I'm going to have a sort of reference map. So here's Sabrina Lake, here's Forbes Pond across the street, Charles River Street, Grove Street. The Guernsey Sanctuary is right about here, and the Needham Wellesley line is kind of right along this way. And there's the Ridge Hill Reservation, which is currently a piece of Needham conservation land that's only tangentially related. When I was in graduate school, we called what Alisa calls storyscapes, we called cultural geography, the way cultures interact and change with the geography around them. When I have third graders in tow, I'll say, jump. You know, we're outside, jump. So what's under your feet? Dirt? Yeah. Grass? Yeah. So what else? So under your feet is everything that ever happened before. The animals, the plants that live in that dirt layer, the bedrock and geology that formed it, and any stuff, any garbage left behind by the people who have lived there. Everything that ever happened in that spot is in the dirt under your feet. So think about, so then think, oh, because third graders think like, you know, the world started yesterday, or whenever they arrived, whichever came first. So when we talk about conservation land or nature sanctuary, it conjures up images of natural wilderness, but in fact, Guernsey is reclaimed from a profoundly altered landscape. The earliest maps of Needham, this is the Barrackaya Mason map of 1771, shows that there were already farms and clearances in this area. So this is the same area that I had in the first map. Trying to do this from the side now. Charles River Street, Grove Street, the Charles River, the Henry Dewing House. These are all in place early in the 1700s. They've already cleared this land. They're already living on this land. They're already farming this land. And we actually know that Dedham residents came over the Charles River into what became the North Parish, Needham and Wellesley, in the 1600s. They were looking for grazing land. Dedham grant to 1636. Before the ink is even dry, they're hopping over the river because a lot of this swampy land, especially that area of cattails that you see from, you know, the highway and West Roxbury train line, was great for grazing. It had plenty of water. You didn't have to cut the trees, no trees. So that was a big deal. This is a closer detail of that place that I circled. So there's Charles River Street again. There's Grove Street. So you can see these streets are in place very, very early in the history of the area. The Dewing family had a garrison house up there in 1676. Henry Dewing's house, which is right here, was in place at least by 1750, possibly sooner. So this has got a significantly long occupation history. Later maps of the same area show that the land began to change went out of the hands of the Dewings, but it was also still farmland, and they continued to encroach. I love this map because it shows the swampy areas and it shows the woodlots. This is Ridge Hill. It's an esker. We'll see it again. And there it is in this map. But you can see, in this map, the farms are starting to push this woodland back. They're starting to encroach on the woodland. And so they're expanding their cultural footprint over this area. It's also pretty much good grazing land. It's also swampy. It's low-lying. It's not good for crops. Great for cows. Cows were the mainstay of the Needham and Wellesley early economy. Also notice that the primary landscape features we're going to discuss, Sabrina Lake and Forbes Pond, are not yet present. And that's because, as has been mentioned, they are man-made. And they're man-made because of a guy named William Emerson Baker, who bought the whole area, 800 acres in that area of the intersection, pretty much that whole area that was circled, starting in 1868, and he turned it into his summer estate. He lived on Comm Ave in Boston. This was his summer estate. And you can see, major clearances, major alteration. Baker Was born in Roxbury in 1828. He went out to work as a teenager, and through a combination of hard work and entrepreneurial spirit, eventually became extremely rich. We were talking about it earlier, $5 million. He retired with $5 million in 1870 money. So it adds up. He parlayed his early investment stake into an investment in sewing machines. This is the beginning of the industrialized economy. Sewing machines were a brand new invention. That's a Grover and Baker machine. A Wellesley Historical Society, I believe, has a Grover and Baker. He teamed up with a guy named Grover. They formed the Grover and Baker Sewing Machine Company. And because this was legal in the day, they got together with Elias Howe and Singer and another company that was big at the time called Wheeler and Wilson. And they formed a trust. And they locked up the patents on the thread mechanisms, the stitch lock mechanisms, basically all the things that make sewing machines good industrial tools. And they had a royalty on every single sewing machine sold pretty much throughout the Western world for 20 years. And that's, and they were selling, Baker was very smart. He would sell his contracts to governments, not to individual seamstresses. So he was selling to both American armies at the time, the French army, the German army, the Russian army, the Dutch army, the English army. So these were huge military contracts. They got incredibly, incredibly wealthy. So in 1868, at the ripe old age of 40, he sold his stake in the company and decided it was time to retire and enjoy the rest of his life. And he was at this point, as I said, incredibly rich. And though he was born into the working class, his wealth enabled him to marry into a higher social class and to socialize with some of the wealthiest people in Boston. And he did a great deal of public good with his money, including supporting educational institutions, public museums, the first Boston Aquarium, the early foundation of MIT, the Museum of Natural History, which became the Museum of Science, and a lot of productive work on public health and nutrition. But the part we're going to talk about here is his summer estate, the Ridge Hill Farms. So once he retired, he decided to purchase a summer estate and chose southwest corner of Needham, the area that we've been talking about, the old Dewing Farm. And over the next couple of years, he bought up the surrounding land, ending up eventually with 800 acres, which he called the Ridge Hill Farms. And so you can see this is a map from 1876, Charles River Street, Grove Street, same as always, but now Baker owns all of this land. And by the time this map was made, he had dug both Forbes Pond and Sabrina Lake. And the best part is he built his house. His house is right there. It's Henry Dewing's old house. So the Ridge Hill Farms was his summer estate. He lived there from May until October, and it was basically an extended pleasure garden. This is Sabrina Lake. This is where he was an imaginative guy. He was a quirky guy. He was wealthy enough to be eccentric and not insane. And this is where he exercised his imagination, tested his theories, he had huge parties. Thousands of people were invited to his parties. And he really it was a physical expression of his opinions in a lot of ways. And I'm just going to run through real quick because I just want you to see sort of how constructed this landscape became. So he had a science museum. He built a number of follies and amusements. He built a 250-room luxury hotel. He had research labs. He had a bowling alley, a couple of restaurants, gardens, greenhouses. I mean, you look at how planned and constructed the landscape is and the scope of the specimen planting, especially in his formal gardens. You can get some idea of how some of these non-native species that Lisa mentioned became present in the environment and got spread through the environment. He brought in all sorts of plants. He had, greenhouses, but he also had gardens outside and formal gardens. So this is an extremely constructed environment. There he is on the porch of his house with his two boys, Walter and Eddie. House is still standing at 430 Grove, and it will be until January when it gets torn down. Sorry, couldn't do anything about it. We tried. So the two early features of Baker's estate were Sabrina Lake and Forbes Pond. And Forbes Pond, which is the smaller of the two, on the southern side, the Charles River side of Charles River Street, was his water supply. It was a spring, a natural spring that he dug out and turned into a pond. He used it, he's got his pump house, his water tower, and it supplied water for the entire estate. And then Sabrina Lake, which was also artificial, was dug out. As Chris mentioned, it wasn't dammed the way Longfellow Pond was. It was actually physically dug out with shovels in a sort of low-lying, swampy area. And he used, this was his pleasure lake. It was for amusement, it was for beauty. It had a spray fountain that cast misty rainbows in the sunshine, and a boathouse for his canoes, and his amphibious steam launch, which he called the Lady of the Lake. Had bridges and artificial islands and scenic landscapes. There's the Lady of the Lake, by the way, peeping out. They probably had opinions of each other, I dare say. This map, this is a more recent map of features of the estate, but this gives you, there's Sabrina Lake, there's Forbes Pond. It gives you an idea of how many, there are 106 numbered objects on this map. How many structures he built, how many features, how densely packed his landscape was. And this is a view from the top of that tower that looked like a church, which was a science museum. And this is a view over the estate. The gardens, his greenhouses are over here. That's the hotel. You can see dimly in the background. There's the lake. So it really is a very managed environment. So Baker was always somewhat eccentric, as I mentioned, but as he grew older, he also became more combative. And Wellesley was incorporated in 1881, and the new boundary ran right through Baker's estate. And he always hated Needham, and now he had two towns to hate. He was very unhappy about this. So he decided that he was going to secede his 800 acres and into a separate town. It was going to be its own separate town that he was going to call Hygeria. And Hygeria was going to be a public health village. This is where, by the later years of his life, all of his efforts were going to public health and nutrition. And he had farms. That's his herd barn and laboratory. He had farms for his bison. He believed bison was healthier than beef. He was actually right about that. He was really seeking to reduce the incidence of pathogens in the food supply. Livestock in America grew up under filthy conditions. I mean, pigs were literally encouraged to eat off the public streets to keep them clean. But you know what was left on public streets, especially in the days of horse-drawn vehicles. So there was tuberculosis was endemic in the milk supply, trichinosis and other diseases were endemic in the pork supply. They transferred easily to humans, and then there would be this big public health effort to try and eradicate these diseases. He said, look, if you prevent the animals from getting these diseases in the first place, it's cheaper, easier, and there'll be a lot less human suffering than trying to solve the problem later. That at the time was a fairly radical idea. This was before the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, and the things that people could legally put in the food supply were terrifying. I mean, literally terrifying. So he believed in clean food handling, sanitary food handling, pure food, non-additive food, and Nigeria was the place all this research was going to take place. And then he asked to be tax-free. He said, well, you know, the benefits, the public benefit from Nigeria is going to save you way more than I'm paying in taxes. Okay, that's the basic justification for a nonprofit organization, right? But in those days, it was not. Petition went to the general court. It was held up by the Needham selectmen for 4 years. It was finally refused. Among other reasons, Baker had not made himself any friends in Needham, but also when Wellesley and Needham split, Wellesley took half, almost exactly half of the land area, but 60% of the taxable acreage. It was by far the wealthier half of town. Thank you, Mr. Honeywell. And now he had 6% of the remaining taxable acreage, and they were not willing to lose another 6% of the tax base. So this was not going to happen. So they finally said no. But this fight took up the last few years of Baker's life, and really the last energy of Baker's life, and it probably shortened it. And he died a few years later in 1888 of a heart attack at the age of 60. Interestingly, there is one part of Baker's estate that probably still is virtually untouched, and that's the part around the Ridge Hill itself. So here's the area of Baker's estate. There's Ridge Hill. This is a modern trail map from Needham of the Ridge Hill Reservation, which basically kind of starts here. Baker's estate was kind of there. Ridge Hill Reservation kind of starts here. So this is sort of the overlap of the two. And around 1902, 1906, a guy named John Torrey Morse built, I'm trying to see it from this perspective, where's the road that comes in, built a house, a hunting lodge on this. In this map, this is the Ridge Hill. And this woodland here, this piece of wetland, woodland, pine swamp here, a little bit of it there, is basically this. It's the leftovers from this. And this is probably, it's now under the control of the Needham Conservation Commission. It's probably the only part of the land that's never been touched, but it probably has never been touched because it has no real use and no economic purpose. So it's always just been the borderland between these two estates. When Baker died, his wife sold off the estate pretty much as quickly as she could. She had no interest in it. She never visited, and she preferred to stay in their Boston home. Photos taken shortly after Baker's death show that it was already deteriorating very rapidly. So this is the view from the tower. This is the same view, and it's not even that much later. There's the hotel. You could see gardens are gone, trees are starting to grow up, greenhouses are gone. There's the house. So you can see how fast nature is reclaiming this space. That's what became of Rosemary Lake. The land was pretty much sold off for house lots as it exists today, and the parts that were not built on began to revert pretty quickly. And in time, the Guernseys acquired a large part of the property, 25 acres of which they gave as conservation land, as we're now discussing today. But you can see how rapidly nature began to reclaim the property once Baker was done. Thank you.
Thank you for the three panelists for a great overview of the stories that land can tell. I'm going to do a brief break as Luke finds the microphone so that you can ask questions. Luke is from Wellesley Media. He is recording it. It'll be available, and we'll send it out to everyone once it's available for distribution. But to ask questions and so that the audience can hear it, we need the microphones, and he's going to find it. And let me just make a plug for the two organizations that are here. The Wellesley Conservation Land Trust, as I said, was 1958. We have 12 properties. We just inherited 2 more from Needham because the Needham Conservation Land Trust went out of business, and somebody had to take their properties because they have had 2 of them. Land trust properties are in perpetuity. Things will never be built on them. If it's owned by a city, that doesn't necessarily mean that something won't be built on it. But if you give land to a land trust, it will always be there. And so the Needham Land Trust looked for somebody, and we were right next door. So just this summer, we passed deeds on inheriting 2 small properties that they had. We're also possibly getting a much larger property from a private donor in Needham. So very possibly, we're going to have a significant land in perpetuity in both Needham as well as the ones that currently exist in Wellesley. So stay tuned. It could even be before the end of the year, but we're not quite sure when it's going to happen. So the land trust is here to preserve land for you, your descendants, and their descendants forever. We're a membership organization. One thing that's going to happen about Guernsey soon is that Bill Giesentammer is going to organize a crowd of folks to put some bridges over. If you've been on Guernsey lately, you've seen some wafers in our soggy areas, and they're somewhat unstable. And that area is going to have wood bridges over it, and will happen probably by mid-November. Bill, nod your head. Maybe. That's the target date.
My fingers crossed.
Okay. And thank you so much for Bill for organizing that. We first have to remove all those wafers that have been pounded into the ground but are still unstable. So that's happening this weekend. So if anybody wants some help to dig into Guernsey for real and be rewarded with things, come on Saturday and Sunday from 10 to 2. Bring a crowbar because they're going to have to be popped up and then removed. And then there will be bridges, wooden bridges, that will go over that area. So that's just one of the things that the Land Trust does with its membership dues. For the Wellesley neighbors, one of its big things is to also keep the older people healthy. And one of the things that's coming on October 7th, and there's a few flyers over on the side table, is the magic and power of music for healthy aging. The speaker, Suzanne Cohen, organizes on the web on Wednesday and Saturday mornings, some for Wellesley neighbors, music and exercise things from 10:30 to noon. And that's part of the Wellesley neighbors' dues. Wellesley neighbors also can provide internal cars to get people to their doctor's appointments if they don't drive or need transportation. So it's a way to create a community among folks, neighbors helping neighbors. It's part of the village program that started in Beacon Hill. We call it Wellesley Neighbors because it's not just Wellesley. It's also Needham and Sherburne and some others in the area. So that's Wellesley Neighbors. So hopefully you have some questions that you've been thinking about, and Alisa will take this over. If you have any questions about Wellesley Neighbors, the Executive Director, Joan Minkley, is here. There's also some board members that are here that can help you. And those that are board members of the Land Trust, raise your hands and we'll be glad to help you. There's a few in the back too. Okay? Alisa, it's yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Okay, one round of applause for all of our panelists, please, while they come up to the table. I invite you to come up to the table. So I think we have the room until 8:30. I'm hoping we can, this is an opportunity to ask questions, or we can have a really good Storyscapes-inspired, cross-disciplinary conversation. So I think for this to be recorded, we need to pass you the microphone and have you ask your question into the microphone. So, any questions, any thoughts, insights, any observations? Michael, thank you.
Lou, could you turn the lights on?
So a hotel doesn't just disappear into nature. How did that disappear?
It burned down. It did. A family called the Alden family, actually descended from John and Priscilla, actually, bought a big chunk of the estate and tried to keep part of it going. But you really needed Baker's money, but you also needed Baker's kind of manic imagination to really keep things going. And things started to fall apart pretty quickly after he died. They did try to keep the hotel going, but it lasted till about, I think, 1892. The big fire. You know, it's at the edges of town. It was too far from the fire system for them to interfere, to get to it quickly enough. When the estate was running, it was busy all the time. It had several restaurants. It had 225 rooms, 12 bathrooms, 225 rooms, 5 showers. But yeah, it was a resort. He sort of ran the place as a resort when it was operating, but then it fell apart.
It's the Disneyland of the North.
Right.
I am curious how Sabrina Lake keeps its water. If it was not a natural lake and it was built or created, what is the input and output from it now?
Great question.
It was marsh, so it may just have been below the water table. Does somebody have that?
So there is inflow and outflow. The inflow is sort of at the Wellesley town end of the lake. The outflow is a small structure that then flows into the Charles River. So there is flow through the lake. Probably this summer, because of the drought, there wasn't very much.
But there was actually too much flow out of it when a beaver stopped up the outflow side, and it started coming back onto the houses that are below it. So
Somebody back here, there. David.
I'd like to know what happens to the turtles and the snakes you showed in the picture when those ponds go completely dry.
It's a great question. So some of the animals, like the fairy shrimp, they go through their entire life cycle fairly short, right? So when the vernal pool is dried up, eggs that were laid previously that are in the leaf litter and the mud and muck will stay there until the right conditions come back again. So that vernal pool could stay dry if there's drought for, years, and those little eggs will sit in that, leaf layer, and when a right temperature and water conditions are present, they hatch, and they'll immediately repopulate the vernal pool by, making lots more eggs. And then seasonally, there's 2 kinds of eggs that the fairy shrimp will lay. For example, the winter egg is the one that will have a harder coating. It'll fall to the bottom of the leaf litter. It'll stay there over winter. It'll stay there when it dries out, and then repopulates again the next spring when the water comes. So a lot of animals either hunker down in the mud or muck. Some of them have to hibernate or find other places in the upland. One of the things about Guernsey is that there's plenty of places where there are areas above or away from the water, and that's where, for example, the wood frog live. They don't stay in the vernal pool. They just use the vernal pool to lay their eggs, and the eggs are on a race against time to hatch, and those little tadpoles grow into full-fledged frogs before the pool dries out, right? And so that they can get out and then continue the cycle again. So many things will either hunker down deep in the mud layer and overwinter there, and then other things will overwinter in the upland area. So that's where those little critters tend to go.
And there's a real cool educational transformer box on the corner of Linden Street and Kingsbury that has those three critters, painted around them. So you see a spotted salamander and a fairy shrimp and the frog
That was
on that box. Yes.
Wellesley, some students from Wellesley High School, after we had gone and did a whole vernal pool lesson at the vernal pool in the North 40 over by Morse's Pond, and they learned about it, and then they learned about it so that they could create this art platform. Yes, it was great collaboration with that.
Questions?
Question up here. Yeah, thank you.
Janet wants to know, any good stories about Baker versus the Honeywells?
No. Part of the reason he had such a fight with Needham is because he really didn't spend, even though he spent half his year here, he didn't really interact with the area at all. He didn't socialize. All of his social life came from Boston. You know, people would come out from Boston. He'd have these huge parties, but none of them were locals. They were, he'd invite the governor or the vice president, other businessmen, but they'd come out from Boston on the train. He had a spur line built from what was then the Charles River Street Station. They would come out on the train, they'd go back on the train. So they never really sort of went through Needham and Wellesley, and he didn't really interact very much with Needham and Wellesley. The only person other sort of wealthy person he had real fights with was William Carter. Carter Cloth Company, Carter's. That company originated in Needham. He was probably the other wealthiest person in Needham. They were both in the textile industry. They both were self-made men. They had very different personalities. Baker was very flamboyant. Carter was very sober in all senses of the word, and they just were like oil and water, and they did not get along. But other than that, he didn't spend a lot of time. I'm sure he knew the Honeywells, but they didn't spend a lot of social time together, and they didn't really interact that much. He doesn't mention them. If he doesn't mention them, they were not at odds. Because if they were, he would mention them.
By the way, over on the corner of the table, I left out some Storyscapes inspired books, and one of the books is, I think it was a Needham Historical or History Center publication about the Ridge Hill Farm and the Baker Estate. So if anyone wants to take a look on your way out, please feel free. There's some great pictures in there too. A question in the back there. Yeah.
A great talk, and the combination, the weaving of the political and economic history and the natural history has been fascinating. I have a question. In the very beginning of the talk, you mentioned corridors linking natural areas and the significance of that for larger mammals. As a larger mammal that enjoys walking, many of us, in fact, obviously walk Ridge Hill, walk the Guernsey Reservation, go along the Charles to the golf course. But my question actually is, there is a connection from Ridge Hill to Grove. There is no connection that I've been able to find from Grove into Guernsey. Are there any plans afoot to actually provide that link for either wild mammals or people?
That's a trails question. I don't know if there's anything, nothing's come across my plate in terms of the NRC, if there's anything with that. Do you know if there's any land trusts thinking about making those.
It's all private property, isn't it? I don't think there's any,
There is,
Public access on that
from,
side?
from Grove, you can enter Livingston, which is not a trail, but you walk on that, and then you can get into the Hale property, Heyl, at the intersection of Ridge Hill Road, which goes into the Susan Lee property, which goes across the aqueduct, which takes you into Guernsey. So there's somewhat of, no.
No, I've searched everywhere for a possible connection, because I'm a runner and walker too, and I'm always in the Ridge Hill and Guernsey and all of those, and there's nothing now, so it would have to come from private property, some sort of donation, as far as I know.
Any other questions, observations?
Chris was
Thoughts?
talking about the rocks, the pudding stones and so forth around, and he didn't talk about the two huge great rocks in Wellesley that everybody knows, or at least most of you do. One is Problem Rock at the corner of Devon, Grove and Dover. Okay. It is a pudding stone, isn't it?
It is, yes.
It is. It's a beautiful one. But even bigger than that is Devil's Slide, which is north of Route 9, Greenwood, Sawyer, down in there. You can go down a path, and there's this huge rock there. I can't imagine that there's a bigger one in Wellesley than that one.
Yeah, that one I think is bedrock, so that's actually attached to the ground, and that's a great example of but there was a split in the granite at some point. A piece of history that I skipped was when Africa, after Guernsey and Needham and Wellesley, crashed into North America and formed the East Coast. Africa then followed, and Morocco butted right up against us. Later split off again, and Guernsey and Wellesley and Needham have been through a number of these kind of crushes and then splits. And granite is super hard to crush. It's under pressure. You just can't do anything to it. But as it splits apart, it doesn't have the tensile strength, so it'll split. And magma shoots up, and Devil's Slide is an example of that, where in one of those events, and I don't know how old it is, but the magma shot up to fill that gap and then cooled really fast. So it looks very different from the granite that might have cooled over 1 million years to form all those crystals. It's just black, Devil's Slide. Really neat piece of geology.
If you go and look at Devil's Slide, you can also see the scrape marks of the direction of which the glacier has traveled across Devil's Slide. So there's some of that, example there too as well.
On the Land Trust, the Wellesley Land Trust website, there is a pamphlet called The Geological Story of Wellesley, right, Chris? Which was authored by Catherine Fowler Billings, who was also a Wellesley College professor, probably in the 40s, 50s. And she was a very interesting figure, but she wrote this very, one of the first, or the first and only book about kind of compiling all of Wellesley's geology into one spot, and that's available on the Land Trust website. So I think, Chris, you have been doing some research over COVID times to try and maybe update parts of that with some new photos. But if folks want to learn more about Wellesley geology in the general sense, not just in Guernsey, that would be a good resource to look for.
And I'll just say it's a terrific resource to identify. It's got like 60 or 100 geological sites in it, so that really all over town, if your eyes are open to it, you can see these amazing geological formations right in town. The only thing I'd add, though, is it was written in 1960 something, before plate tectonics was known about. So the glacial part of it, when it's describing that, is dead on, but where it's trying to figure out the origins of all the other stuff, you don't want to
Take it with a grain of salt.
take that with a grain of salt, because they didn't know about plate tectonics and how all that came to be. And they didn't have any way to date it yet, so they didn't know. I can tell you this rock is 604 million years old because they figured out how to date it. And I can tell you this one is 590-something million years old because while this was sliding down the coast of the volcanic island chain, there were still eruptions going on. So there was volcanic ash and sometimes interspersed with lava as it was being formed, and we can date that volcanic ash, to a really close level.
Another thing that Wellesley Land Trust does is offer a number of walks. Chris does at least 2 geology walks a year, usually in different places, and a firefly walk. Bill Giesendammer does a bat walk, and he and his wife, Alisa Landry, also do some spring bird walks. In the spring, we do 5 April Sunday walks. We moved it back a week because the migrations are coming up. Because it's warming, the birds come up a little bit earlier, so we start the last Sunday in April and go into May. And it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'll take you on a bird walk somewhere. So look for all the things that we're doing in town, and bring kids along with you. One of the most interactives are some of the school kids that have just had the geology course in their, and they have this conversation with Chris. So on behalf of the Land Trust, we really want to thank the Fund for Wellesley for getting this started, and Lisa for picking up on it, and thank you so much, Alisa. And for the 3 wonderful panelists for giving us a real in-depth series of stories about what Guernsey can tell. So go out on Guernsey, go up for our walk, which should be November 2nd. We'll probably do a morning session and an afternoon session. And then I'll do one just for Wellesley neighbors that we'll try to find a path that doesn't have as many routes. And so you can still see the glory of Guernsey, but safer. So thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And thank you all.